Welcome back to our Database Design and Development unit. Today we will be looking at the topic of design, specifically entity relationship diagrams. Our learning intentions for today are as follows. We will learn what a relationship is with regards to entities in a database, learn how entities in a database are linked by relationships, learn how relationships that exist between entities are defined, and we will learn how the relationships that exist between entities can be represented using a diagram. As always, our success criteria, which should be referred to throughout the lesson. By the end of the lesson, we'll be able to identify a primary key in an entity, be able to identify a foreign key in an entity, be able to identify the cardinality of a relationship, be able to name a relationship, and be able to draw an entity relationship diagram. Before we move forward, let's look at a definition for entity relationship diagram. A design notation to show the relationships between entities in a database known as an ERD for short. Let's look at defining relationships between our entities. Once the analysis stage is complete, our designer must identify all of the entities and define the relationships that exist between those entities. These entities and relationships can be defined and visualized through the creation of entity relationship diagrams. Our designers will go through a series of steps in order to create these entity relationship diagrams. We will take you through these steps now. Let's work our way through an example. Execution error is a forum for students to discuss computing science. A relational database is used to store the details of forum members and their posts using two related tables. Step 1. There are two entities in the execution error database, member and post. Both of these entities are shown here as tables. Step 2 is identifying the primary keys, or the key fields. The primary key for the member entity is memID. This has been highlighted in the member entity table. The primary key for the post entity is post-ID. This has now been highlighted in the post entity table. Let's now look at identifying the relationship now. The name and the cardinality of the relationship must be defined at this phase. When we refer to cardinality, we talk about the numerical aspect of the relationship. In National 5, cardinality is always one to many. At this point, the designer will phrase and answer two questions about the entities. Firstly, can a single member submit many posts? And secondly, can a single post be submitted by many members? Let's look at the answers to these questions. Can a single post be submitted by many members? The answer to that would be no. And our second question, can a single member submit many posts? Yes, Of course they can. This would mean that a relationship would equal one member makes many posts. Step 4. Identifying the foreign keys. At the start we already identified the primary keys. Now we are looking to identify the foreign key. Now that we've identified our cardinality as being one to many, one member can make many posts, we can now insert the primary key from the member table into the post table as the foreign key. This is achieved by copying the primary key from the member entity into the post entity. Now that we have gone through a series of steps to identify our entities, identify our primary keys, the name and the cardinality of the relationship, and our foreign key, we can now start to build and draw our diagram. The first step would be to represent the entities using labelled rectangles like so. We would then insert our relationship, followed by the cardinality, highlighted by the crow's feet in this case, and a description of the relationship. This is also important. So there are three items: the relationship, which is defined by the straight line going between member and post, the cardinality, which is shown using the crow's feet at the post end, signifying many, and the description of the relationship, makes. One member makes many posts. The next step is to add our entity attributes around our entities. These will be represented as labelled ellipses. We can see that we have each entity attribute going around the entities. For member, we have memID, last name, level, and email. And for post, we have post ID, subject, date, and memID, which was inserted, of course, as our foreign key. The final step in drawing this entity relationship diagram will be to highlight our key fields, our primary keys and our foreign key. This is done by underlining our primary key in each entity, memID and post ID, and by highlighting our foreign key using an asterisk, which would be memID in the post entity. This would complete our entity relationship diagram, where we would possibly gain 4 marks. We would certainly gain a mark for our relationship description, makes. We would gain a mark for our cardinality. We would gain a mark for identifying our key fields. And we would possibly gain a mark for populating our entity attributes around the entities. By being able to create this diagram, you will hopefully pick up those marks. That brings us to the end of our database design lesson on entity relationship diagrams. We hope you learned lots about entity relationship diagrams and learn how to create one. Thank you once again for visiting our YouTube channel, Grive High Business and Computing Science. Don't forget to tell your friends about us, and please subscribe.